The morning Earl Pickett fired up the old 1978 New Holland 269 square baler for the first time that season, his neighbour Denny Hargrove leaned against the fence post at the edge of his own field and laughed. Not a mean laugh, exactly. More the kind of laugh a man lets out when he's already decided something is foolish and wants the world to know he's decided it. "Earl," Denny called across the ditch. "You still running that antique? My round baler puts up 200 bales before lunch. That thing of yours'll do what, 60? Earl didn't answer. He checked the nodder, ran a grease gun along the pickup teeth, and climbed up onto the tractor seat. The 4020 John Deere underneath him was no younger than the baler behind it. He pulled out of the shed and into the cut field without a word. The field lay flat and dry in the morning heat, the cut stubble pale and brittle where it should have been green, the kind of field that told you everything about the season before a single forecast was read. That was the first week of July. The summer of the drought nobody had fully predicted, though the signs had been there all spring for anyone paying attention. The creek that ran along the south end of Earl's property had dropped 2 feet by June. The pasture grass had come in thin. The alfalfa was on its second cutting already, but it was short and sparse, not the thick lush stands of a wet year. The old-timers at the diner said it reminded them of the summer of 1988, which nobody had liked. The younger farmers looked it up on their phones and shrugged. Still, Earl had hay. Not a lot, but hay. The first was from a cattle operation over in the next county. A man named Blevins, who ran 300 head of Angus and had planted his whole operation on the assumption that the co-op would have hay if he needed it. The co-op did not have hay. The co-op was in the same drought as everyone else, had been since May, and was telling people so now only after stringing them along through most of June with the kind of careful optimism that costs the listener more than the speaker. "I do," Earl said. "What are you asking?" Earl had been selling square bales for $9 apiece for the last 4 years. He said 12. Blevins didn't even pause. "I'll take everything you've got." Earl sold him 400 bales and still had 1,500 in the barn from the first cutting and the early second. Denny Hargrove's phone was ringing too, as it turned out. But Denny had a problem Earl didn't. Denny's big round bales, each one 800 pounds wrapped in net, were what the big operations liked in a normal year. Efficient to move, easy to feed with a tractor and spear. But the calls Denny was getting now were from small operators. Horse people. Hobby farmers with a dozen goats. A man outside of town who kept 4 cattle on 5 acres and had no equipment to handle a round bale at all. A retired schoolteacher with 3 sheep she'd bought during the pandemic and never gotten rid of, who had hay delivered before and found that source dried up and gone, same as everything else that summer. "Can't do it," Denny told them one after another. "I don't have square bales. Never have." He called Earl one evening in late July. "Selling to whoever's buying," Earl said. "What are you getting?" Earl thought about it. 14 now, he said. That was true. He'd raised the price twice already as the calls kept coming in. There was a long silence on Denny's end. $14 a square bale. Another silence. "I got a lady who wants 50 bales for her horses. I told her I couldn't help her. You want the number?" "Sure," Earl said, and wrote it down. That was the beginning of a strange thing that happened over the rest of that summer, which was that Earl Pickett, the man with the slow old baler, became one of the most called upon farmers in the region. Not because he had the most hay, though he had more than most. Not because his hay was the finest quality, though it was decent. But because he had the right kind. Because 46 years had taught the 269 a kind of reliability that no new machine has yet earned, and Earl had learned to trust what it taught him. Square bale stack. Square bales fit in the back of a pickup truck. A woman with 2 horses and a barn with low clearance can carry square bales herself, one at a time, without a tractor, without a loader, without anything except a pair of gloves and a willingness to lift. Square bales are what the small people need, and the small people, it turned out, were everywhere, and they were desperate, and they would pay. By the end of August, Earl was getting $18 a bale. He had waiting lists. He had people calling from 2 states away asking if he'd ship, which he wouldn't, but the calls kept coming anyway. He ran the old 269 every time the weather let him, kept it greased and adjusted, replaced the worn pickup teeth mid-season, and watched it keep throwing bales with its slow, mechanical patience, one every 8 seconds, the same way it had thrown bales since the Carter administration. His nephew Travis, who had spent 2 summers pushing Earl to upgrade, came out one afternoon and watched the baler work for a while before he said anything. "How much have you put up so far?" Travis asked. "Little over 4,000 this season," Earl said. Travis did the math slowly, accounting for what he'd seen Earl charging. "That's a good year," Earl said. Earl nodded. He knew. Denny had called him again, not to talk about referrals this time, but just to talk, the way farmers do when things aren't going the way they expected, and the only comfort is that someone else understands what unexpected costs. The round baler was a magnificent machine. Earl had always known that. It was faster, there was no question. It put up more tonnage per hour. It made a product that was easier to handle at scale, easier to store uncovered in a field, easier to feed with equipment designed for it. For the large commercial operations that bought hay by the ton, round bales was simply better. But farming didn't happen only at scale. It happened at every scale, and at the small end of the scale, the old slow square baler was not obsolete. It was irreplaceable. Earl didn't think of himself as a man who had made a wise strategic decision. He thought of himself as a man who had kept using what he had because it worked, and because he'd paid it off 30 years ago, and because he understood it well enough to fix it himself when it broke, which it did sometimes, the way everything does. He had not kept the 269 because he was clever. He had kept it because he was the kind of man who keeps things. That fall, after the first frost, Earl sold the last of his hay for $20 a bale to a woman who drove 2 hours to pick it up in a borrowed stock trailer. She had 12 sheep and 2 horses and a husband who had just lost his job, and she counted the money out from an envelope like it mattered to her, which Earl could see it did. She had the careful, unhurried way of counting that people have when the number is fixed and there is no room in it for error. "I heard you're the one to call," she said at one point. "Word gets around," Earl said. "You going to have hay next year?" "Plan to," he said. He didn't know what next year's weather would bring. Nobody did. But he planned to plant, and he planned to cut, and he planned to run the 269 as long as it held together, which given that it had already held together for 46 years seemed like a reasonable bet. She drove away in the late afternoon light. Earl walked back to the barn and stood in the empty space where the hay had been all summer, the floor still dusty with chaff and the smell of cut alfalfa hanging in the air the way it does, sweet and dry and a little like summer itself preserved in a form you could almost put your hands on. He thought about Denny, who was fast. He thought about all the fast things, the new things, the efficient things, the optimized things that filled every catalogue and every conversation at the implement dealer. He did not think they were wrong. He just thought they were not the only right thing. There was a whole world of people with 2 horses or a dozen sheep or 4 goats out back, people who needed 50 bales or 20 bales or sometimes just 10, people who couldn't handle a round bale if their lives depended on it, people who drove 2 hours to fill a trailer and counted money from envelopes. They needed what he made. The old baler had always been slow. That had never changed. What changed was that the world, for one dry summer, had remembered what slowness could make, and that what it made had value, the kind of value that turned out, when you added it up at the end of a season in a drought year with hay scarce and the small people desperate, to be worth more than speed. Earl switched off the barn light and walked back to the house. Supper would be on. The 269 sat in the shed where it always sat, patient and greased and ready, waiting for next year's cutting the same way it had waited through every winter since 1978, which is to say without complaint, without ambition, and without any awareness at all that it had just had its finest season.